In September of 1996, Comme des Garçons presented their worst-selling collection to date. The clothes were mocked by the press and became an unflattering meme among 1990s media outlets, earning the nickname the Lumps and Bumps Show. 30 years later, the show is universally hailed as a masterpiece. The bizarre shapes of the collection are spoken about in low tones of reverence by fashion designers. It's honored in exhibitions around the world, and it is fervently sought after by collectors. Calling anything the greatest of all time is impossible to defend, so I'll be a little bit more objective in my speech. Comme des Garçons' Spring 97 collection, which is called Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body, is fashion's most influential collection of all time. There had been conceptual fashion shows before this, but none had gone as hard as this one. We had never traveled so far off the shore. So yeah, fine. Something was super unpopular when it came out and now it's a classic. That happens all the time. It's the same story with Star Wars, The Black Parade, Rocky Horror Picture Show. The difference with this show is that no one still seems to understand what actually happened with it. Even people who claim to love it probably haven't even seen all of the looks from the show. Today, we are going in deep. We are going to consider every angle, every look, every possible everything in order to uncover what this show is doing on a mechanical level. We are going to finally try to understand what Rei Kawakubo was actually doing with these looks. No more gatekeeping. We are going all the way with this one. I feel an enormous amount of pressure in this episode to give you a tidy, crystallized, molten answer to the question, what does this show mean? And I just don't think I can give that to you, but I think that might be the wrong question. What we should be asking for Spring 97 is, how does this show make meaning? We can only answer that question by exploding the collection apart, zooming the lens in further and further until we can see each little piece and how it connects to the other little pieces. But first, Chapter 0, the basics. We are going to be jumping around so much during this part. Comme des Garçons has many diffusion lines. There are lots of designers and lots of even different brands that are all under their umbrella. You've seen many of them before. The important thing that we need to understand that when we just see the name Comme des Garçons by itself, that's the main event. All the other things are in service to this vision. Comme des Garçons has existed as a Japanese fashion brand since 1969. The name is French, of course, and translates to like the boys. Importantly, when this show took place, Spring 97, Comme had been in business for 30 years. They had been showing in Paris for more than 15 years as well. So this was not like some crazy art school kid showing up and just doing something wacky on a Paris runway. This was a 54-year-old fashion designer showing up yet again to a place where she is established and respected, and she's flexing her muscles. Most people still refer to this as the Lumps and Bumps Show. I'm saying it here officially. This is called Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body. First challenging note incoming. It would not be possible to talk about this show unless we also discuss a 1986 collection by British designer Georgina Godley that was called Lump and Bump. To be specific, there are two different scholars who say it has two different names. Andrew Bolton says it's called Hump and Bump. Francesca Granata says it is called Bump and Lump. A lot of you who knew about Georgina Godley's collection before you started this video are probably waiting on me to make some kind of statement about whether or not this is theft. I personally do not think that there is actual theft here. Georgina Godley was making a really profound conceptual fashion statement in the 1980s. Considering that most of the conceptual fashion that we all know and talk about occurred during the Cambrian explosion of conceptual fashion in the 1990s and early 2000s, to do something like this in the 1980s was a really brave thing to do. Like, I can only imagine that every human being that came into contact with this collection, whether they were buyers or Georgina's mom or just anybody, clutched their pearls and went, "But Georgina, who will buy this?" So I want to give huge props to Georgina Godley for being brave enough to make a statement like this at the time that she did. But we also need to give flowers to Rei Kawakubo for making a somewhat similar but artistically separate statement. Having personally looked at these two collections at this point for years, I really don't think it's difficult to differentiate what these two women were doing. And for someone to claim that Rei Kawakubo was stealing from Georgina Godley, I think is intellectually dishonest. For the specifics of that, we'll be unwinding Ray's collection for the rest of this episode, obviously, but the simplest way to put it is that Georgina Godley's collection very closely resembles actual human anatomy. This all looks like a exaggerated and unrealistic version of an actual human body, whereas Ray Kawakubo's work just doesn't even really resemble a human form at all. It's worth noting here via Granata that Ray did not like her work being compared to Georgina Godley's work. There was one exhibition where they were going to display Ray's Spring 99 collection, not Spring 97, it was Spring 99. They were going to display Ray's Spring 99 collection along with pieces from Georgina Godley, and Ray just said, no, we're not going to do that. If you want to know more about Georgina Godley, Francesca Granata, the genius, did a wonderful interview with her and a lot more details in this book, Experimental Fashion. It's super cheap. You should check it out. Back to Comme. So the core inspiration, the very genesis of this collection, according to a quote from Adrian Joff, Ray Kawakubo's husband, is, quote, Ray's anger at seeing a Gap shop window filled with banal black clothes, end quote. To Ray's credit, this was absolutely a time when the Gap was kind of changing the game in fashion by saying that your clothes should never be making a statement. Your clothes should only point to your own personality. So the clothes must be as simple as possible. You can see maybe how that idea might anger Ray. And she does emphasize in quotes all over the place. Like in the many times that she's been interviewed, she emphasizes a lot that she is just angry all the time, and specifically angry with all her own collections. But she did note to Vogue Japan one time that she was the least dissatisfied with this collection, Spring 97. Okay, so let's reflect a little bit on what we're looking at. We're not getting into the really heavy interpretation yet, we're just saying what we see. The show contained no music, and it opened on a plain, blank, square runway. The first look emerges, and there's actually a really clever trick that's being done here. So what we see is a model walking out in a voluminous skirt and a mostly sheer top. We've, of course, had to edit it here so that we don't get demonetized, but rest assured, you can fully see her breasts. Since this show took place in 1996, we are in an era that fashion scholars refer to as the sexy va-va-voom era of fashion. This is like when Tom Ford was at Gucci, when Gianni Versace was crushing it at the height of his career. Fashion is extremely sexy right now. If you're looking at this first look dead on, Ray kind of tricks us into thinking that she is participating in fashion's sexual revolution. Then the model turns and we see the lumps. Okay, importantly, the sheer top has already switched the audience's brains to thinking more about the model's body. Like, we're thinking more about her breasts than we're thinking about the skirt, for example. If the first thing we saw was this, for example, we might just say, wow, why is the shirt like that? But because we opened with so much emphasis on nudity, the question switches from, why is the shirt like that? And the question becomes, oh no, what happened to her? Kawakubo-san sets us up to mistake her designs for the body of the model herself. The most common interpretation of this show is way too simplistic. It just usually chalks it up to, oh, this show is simply Kawakubo rejecting norms about the body. Like as if she's saying, oh, you think this is beautiful? Well, I'm gonna put this on my runway. And while this show is a rejection of norms, there is so much more here that rewards a closer examination. Let's talk about garment construction here a little bit. What journalists referred to as the lumps were down goose feather filled pads. Most of them looked like this, but importantly, the first look had goose down feather filled pads that looked like this. They're knitted. There's this wonderful myth among non-fashion people that like, oh, this stuff is never actually made. No one actually buys or sells this stuff. These were produced and they were sold. They technically were sold as separate pieces. You could buy the pieces without the pads inside of them. And if you wanted to buy the pads, they cost $200, which in 2023 money is about $350. The patterns for the garments themselves had little openings where you were able to slip the pads in or take them out. That can be seen most clearly in the transparent version of this motif. And really, most of these garments didn't even look all that strange if you just took the pads out. Again, via Dr. Granata, the clothes were sent to Vogue and Elle to photograph for their editorials with the pads sewn in, but Elle and Vogue both went to lengths to remove the pads so they could just photograph them in the most inoffensive way possible. I'm bringing that up to say this collection actively made people uncomfortable. Look 2 is when Rei Kawakubo throws the gauntlet down and assures you that shit is going to continue to get weird. Let's talk about materials. Most of the looks used a fabric that was a combination of 70% stretch nylon and 30% polyurethane. That just meant that the final result was just super duper stretchy. Stretch material was actually one of the only things that Rei herself knew in her own private brain that she wanted to use before the collection started. I'm paraphrasing here from an interview with Sarah Mower for Vogue Japan in 2001, but Rei essentially said that she wanted to create something that didn't resemble anything else. She wanted to design clothes, not bodies. Bodies, not clothes. And she also wanted to use really stretchy fabrics. Many of the looks feature this print, which is called a gingham. Gingham is complicated and it's used in all different kinds of contexts, but the most popular context is the stay-at-home supermom. Armed with an apron, perfect hair, and lipstick, moms have sported this Leave It to Beaver looking ass fabric since the 1950s. Jokes aside, there is this heavy connotation of American domesticity, and we can even see that theme reflected in some editorials that were done by people outside of the Comme organization, here showing a woman at home life using the tools of her own domesticity. If you were unfamiliar with this collection before now, or even unfamiliar with Comme before now, the ultimate goal of Rei Kawakubo is to create something new. And not new as in like, wow, I've never seen pants like that before. New as in like, I have gone past the notion of challenging what pants are. She wants to go past all of that. Later on in this video, we're going to discuss how she creates newness through her process, but for now, all we need to know is that the ultimate goal here is new. Moving on, we have a ton of variations on this same idea. Some are in this gingham, some are in a single color, others are in this wild, colorful print. There's a number of these that are in this super bright red. That's a whole section of this show. And it may have been easy for some of the audience members who were viewing this live to kind of take this as a joke, and some of them were gonna laugh and crack jokes no matter what happened, but the tone of this show is held in a dark place primarily through the makeup and the hair of the models. This is, of course, the 1990s, so the grungy makeup thing is a wider theme in these years, but this makeup for this show goes much farther with the idea, to the point where the redness around the eyes looks like the type of facial bruising that comes after a facelift. Further unsettling are these strings that seem to be tied around the forehead and the hair, just tight enough to cause more bulging and redness. Something else to note here is that the pads are not consistent in their placement on the body from look to look. It's always in different places, and really at no point in the whole show does it make it look like it's an exaggerated human body. It's always in the wrong place. For example, this is clearly not supposed to be the model's actual butt. Like, it's off center, it's misshapen in a couple of ways to the... okay, I think we're far enough in the video at this point for me to just say, this is clearly not supposed to be someone's ass.
My butt is real. It runs in the fam.
I can't swear for the first couple of minutes of YouTube videos, and so I have to wait a little bit. Another example, if the padding is anywhere close to the model's chest, it's too high for anyone to think that it is the actual breasts of the person. And the padding is even placed so lumpily that it causes this split near the sternum so that you can see through to the model's body and know for a fact these are not breasts, this is something else. There's also an enormous amount of asymmetry in almost every single look. The right shoulder is higher than the left shoulder. There's some kind of bulge that goes from the left hip down to the right ankle. Everything is asymmetrical. And here, the dainty S curve of a straight upright woman is interrupted here by this big old lumbar pillow. All forms of balance that humans strive for in their body are being interrupted by these goose feather filled down pads. Okay, so usually these lumpy looks are the only ones that get discussed regarding this collection. But there is a second category of looks that are kind of these non-human, organic type looks. These are looks that, again, are made of polyester, but which feel visually like they just kind of grew naturally and could be pulled off the branches of a tree or retrieved grieved after they detached from a group of sea anemones and washed up on the beach. We even have footage to show us that this look in particular was meant to be a little runway performance where the model emerges out of the flower petal-like dress. We actually get a pretty solid clue about this second category from the first look, wherein the model is wearing a skirt that's more often seen in that second category than in the lump looks. We can see here that the skirt is just safety pinned on. It's actually like really loudly safety pinned on. Now, for most runway shows, this would be massively embarrassing. There's like whole TikTok accounts dedicated to doing takedowns of designers that like have to safety pin things on the runway. But here, it is purposeful. On the secondhand market, there have been a number of sales of the skirts from this collection, and all of them have included a giant safety pin like the one that we saw on the runway. Those safety pins were manufactured as part of the skirts because they are part of the purposeful design of the skirts. Ray backs this up in a quote to American Vogue from 1992. You'll notice that this quote comes from before this collection came out, but it's still very relevant here. She says, quote, "Too much importance has been placed on slick, polished images. I show clothes that aren't finished and expose their construction to indicate the value of things that are primitive and imperfect," end quote. Ray is one of the early founders of the deconstruction movement in fashion. I don't know if she would admit to that, but it's just kind of true. So the safety pin thing, like showing the process, showing the imperfect parts of the clothes on the outside of the clothes, that is a very typical thing for the deconstruction tradition. But also, all of the kind of non-human organic looks seem as if they were not constructed by human hands, but rather just sort of whisked together naturally. Whereas like, they didn't actually have to get dressed in the morning. The clothes just naturally hover on them as if a fairy godmother just kind of poofed their clothes onto them. These skirts needed to be safety pinned in order to achieve that desired effect. We're not really going to spend much more time on the organic shapes looks from this show because frankly, the history of interpretation for this show does emphasize the lump looks more, and Ray Kawakubo herself even emphasized the lump looks in her collaboration with Merce Cunningham on their scenario piece. And also, it's just more fun to talk about the lump looks, so that's where we're gonna stay. Speaking of separate segments of the collection, you have probably seen pictures or videos of this. Like I just said, this piece is called Scenario. It's a collaboration between Ray and the choreographer Merce Cunningham. This piece is unbelievably important to understanding the overall collection, and we will definitely be getting to it later. Please be patient. Final note on the general overview of this collection. These all red looks are really unusual because I believe they make reference to the traditional practice of baby wearing, which is where you wear a baby. Here it is depicted as if the baby is fully cocooned in the mother, sort of a kind of like strange, almost parasitic reimagining of pregnancy. Okay, wait. Does the thing that I just said, the parasitic reimagining of pregnancy, does that sound like a stretch to you? That might be a stretch. I mean, it's really easy to stretch the symbolism of this show. I mean, for example, I could go off on some wild interpretation about this look where, she uses this look to sort of begin a theme of the circle of life throughout the entire collection. I could say that this look is the foundation of that circle of life theme by saying that it is showing a woman here in the act of lovemaking. The dress creates two legs. These are her legs, the woman's legs. They're open, and the literal legs on the model's body are the legs of her lover. We here see that his face is even buried in her neck. This look is the act of sex itself. And then there's other looks that are this kind of bizarre twist on pregnancy. And then this look is the begrudging, angry mother after she's given birth. She regrets having the child. Maybe this show is about the rare infectious disease elephantiasis, wherein certain limbs on the body grow to many times their normal size. There are so many interpretations of this show, and there's so many plausible statements that Comme could be making. How do we even sort them, let alone prioritize which interpretations are more helpful? Ray Kawakubo actually helps us out with that. Chapter 1, Binaries. We begin this interpretation with a ruthless fact. Spring 97 resists interpretation. And we don't really think of art in those terms usually. Usually art is completely subjective, to each their own opinion. But there's sometimes, some very few times, where an artist can set up defense mechanisms against certain types of interpretation so that those interpretations are objectively incorrect. How is that even possible? The light has shifted and I have to block it. Hang on. Okay. We have to discuss something that has the potential to fuck up your whole life. It probably won't, but it could. Are you ready? Binaries. Okay, I promise the entire video isn't going to be like this, but we have to get into a little bit of cultural theory here. The whole idea of binaries and Ray Kawakubo's work has been explored very, very well by Andrew Bolton in his book for the Met Gala exhibition on Ray Kawakubo's body of work. We're going to expound that out a great deal here, but if you want to get this book and read it, it's one of the best fashion books ever written. Andrew Bolton is a genius. Everyone's brain is different, but a commonality with our brain is that the way that we process information is largely shaped through language. Like it or not, the way that we speak and the way that we write has a massive effect on the way that we understand the world around us. A huge part of language is just binaries, and the easiest way to understand this is that it's just opposites. So stuff like hot, cold, presence, absence, sitting, standing. All of these are binaries. This is a complete coincidence, but there are two major things that we're going to be talking about involving binaries. The first one is straightforward. Both sides of the binary help to define each other. One cannot exist without the other. It is not possible for me to understand light without having experienced darkness. Binaries are not just matched up for fun. The way that we created the definitions, one cannot exist without the other one. The second thing to know about binaries is that usually one of the words is dominant in the relationship. A lot of this has become political, like man, woman, black, white, abled, disabled. There is, unfortunately, one of these things that culturally tends to be more dominant, and that causes a lot of issues. But even if you ignore examples like that, there are huge universal ones that everyone absolutely agrees on is prioritized over the other, like life, death. Everyone prioritizes life over death, right? Like it would be insane to prioritize death. So that's binaries. Comme is extremely interested in binaries. Bolton posits in this book that Ray's career can be understood by looking at it through the lens of binaries. And even beyond like going to a super academic place for it, it's not really hard to see that. Like the brand means like the boys, but it's known for its women's wear. They have a unisex fragrance that is called Girl. Like they make it very clear that they're kind of trying to manipulate, break down, or sort of complicate binaries in some way. But there's one binary in particular that we need to discuss for pretty much the rest of this episode, and that is subject and object. And to put that simply, it just means a person and their clothes. Let's look at this binary based on the standards that we just said a moment ago. Subject and object. Do they help define each other? Absolutely. There has never been a person alive who has not been at least somewhat defined by the clothes that they wear. Additionally, clothes are ultimately defined by the people who wear them. Like if I show you a picture of vestments, even if there's not a person wearing the vestments, you have very specific thoughts and associations with this garment in particular. It is not neutral. Same with like Eagles jerseys. This jersey does not just say, I am a fan of the Philadelphia Eagles. This jersey says, if you Google which NFL fans are the meanest, I am the first thing that comes up on Google Images. The football people will love that joke. They're such a niche subculture. This is not merely a sneaker model by Nike that was discontinued in the 90s. This was part of the uniform for the cult Heaven's Gate. People are defined by the clothes that they wear. Clothes are defined by the people who often wear them. It's a never-ending chicken and egg cycle. Okay, so the second part of binaries. Which one is dominant? Subject is dominant. I am dominant over my clothes. My clothes, the object, those exist to serve me. I am always the one in charge. Back to Comme. This show is titled Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body. This show destroys the subject-object binary. It destroys it. But how would you even do that? How would you destroy a binary? Do you just like cut the little line between them? Nope. As we said, you cannot just cut the line between them. Subject and object, both ends of the binary, they need each other in order to exist. The collection is called Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body. In order to destroy the binary, Comme combined them. You becomes the dress becomes you. And now you are one new primordial soup. The sun is still being weird. I gotta move back. But why? There wasn't any injustice going on here. Like, we're talking about me and my clothes. My clothes are not conscious. There's no oppression going on here. My clothes do exist to serve me. So what's the problem? Chapter 2, Changing Bodies. There is no shortage of body shaming in fashion. Like, whether or not we're intending to, the industry reinforces a lot of shitty standards about the human body. That gets discussed a lot, especially today, but we usually don't talk about how our relationship to our own bodies and the bodies of others changes as time progresses. Now, the corny way for me to talk about this would be for me to start like waving around images of fertility icons and be like, hey dummy, body standards change, you know. Or I could like pull up some paintings of women from the 15th century and show how they really preferred for their hair to start mid-dome back then. I don't think those examples are particularly helpful though, because I think somewhere in all of our brains, whether this is correct or not, we all believe that if you go back far enough, people preferred and did all kinds of weird, crazy stuff, and that doesn't really apply to the modern world. But beauty standards change a lot more than you would think. Like, you could take ass shape, for example, and never in my whole life did I think that I would be saying the sentence, take ass shape, for example, in front of tens of thousands of strangers, but here we are. Take ass shape, for example. For proof, I am going to turn you over for the first time on this channel to Michael Kors.
There isn't a woman on the planet who would say, oh, I want people to think I have a fat butt and big hips. Like, she just doesn't exist.
Folks, that is season 7 of Project Runway. That is from 2010. The amount of change that our body expectation standards changed in just a few years is unbelievable. Body standards change super quickly. That's our big takeaway. So the 1980s were a huge shift for body standards. This was an exciting time for women for the most part. They were joining the workplace in droves. Power shoulders technically came in the 70s, but they were really going through like a power shoulder moment in the 1980s. And along with all of these changes came body standard changes, but specifically they were body standard changes through technology. Humans have always used technology to improve our lives. Textiles were one of the first technologies that humans ever invented. Cotton, cashmere, wool, none of this stuff comes out of the ground or comes off of an animal as a bolt of fabric. It has to be processed and coaxed into cloth. If you're stubborn and don't want to think of textiles as a technology, glasses are a great example of something that we wear on our bodies to improve our lives. So the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, this was all a whirlwind time when our relationship to technology was rapidly changing, specifically through the way that we thought about that technology in terms of our bodies. We take all of this for granted now, but I'm literally wearing contacts right now. Contacts are a product that you augment your body by stuffing it inside of your body, and it makes your life better. Bodybuilding is a sport where you precisely track your calorie intake along with your exercise routine so that you can be as huge as possible. Arnold Schwarzenegger widely popularized this sport throughout the 70s and 80s, and along with that and all the changing roles of women, female bodybuilding became big as well. Medical tech changed drastically as well. Plastic surgery was originally created to help veterans with their life-altering injuries that they sustained during wartime. But one day in the 1960s, the horniest doctor said, guys, what if we made boobs bigger? And then bam, the body mods kicked off. Liposuction, BBLs, rhinoplasty, forehead lifts, chemical peels, fucking Botox, baby, labiaplasty, laser hair removal, laser eye surgery, tummy tucks, all forms of filler. Many of the people watching this shit right here, this very video, are 25 or younger, which means that all of you are digital natives. You grew up around all this body modification stuff so much that it doesn't even register with you. But there really was a time in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s where people saw so much radical change happening that they thought we were evolving as a species. Like, with all of these alterations that were not just happening to us naturally, that we were gleefully partaking in, surely with all of this, we've reached some kind of like evolutionary benchmark, right? The single best interpretation that I have ever read of this show comes from the brilliant Caroline Evans through her seminal fashion book, Fashion at the Edge. If this is too expensive for you, it recently got reprinted. It's a lot cheaper now. You should get it. Caroline Evans argues that, quote, they, meaning CDG, they began to sketch new possibilities of subjecthood, a subjecthood which was not concerned with containing the body, but with extending it via new networks and new communications, end quote. So good. Ray was born in 1942. She had grown up in and spent several decades in a world where celebrities weren't getting a new body. She knew a world where extreme bodybuilding wasn't part of the public conversation, and a world where phones could not just travel with you for convenience. Considering all of the recent societal changes that Ray Kawakubo was seeing in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the first half of the 90s, it wasn't surprising that she saw the topic of new bodies not just as a possibility, but as an urgent matter that needed to be discussed right now. Remember binaries? Subject, object, combining them? The conversation around binaries starts to get really fuzzy leading up to the 90s. Like we talked about my contacts earlier, my vision is bad enough that I honestly am not me without my glasses or contacts. Like if I don't have my contacts in, I definitely can't drive, and I would have to be guided around in public by hand by my wife. If my world becomes that small without my contacts, are they a part of me? If you spend tons of time and money getting gains, those gains they're a literal physical part of you, for better or for worse. And if you were to get a liposuction, a small BBL, rhinoplasty, some lip filler, and some Botox, for better or for worse, your life is going to look very different after those procedures. Are those procedures part of you? It's really easy here to start getting into value assessments like, oh, lip filler is terrible for society, or like, actually, lip filler is a good thing. And that is not what I am trying to do. My only point here is that the subject-object binary, me and the object, lip filler, just things start getting really fuzzy in this conversation. Like if you ask me, Bliss, what does me mean? I would say, I don't know, probably like my brain, I guess. But me without my contacts? That will absolutely not be the same me. When you look at this show, when you see these models, it's not a coincidence that many people's first thought is deformed bodies. Never mind that these models clearly do not have any visible disabilities. Like, I'm not undermining the visual brilliance of this collection, but the shape is clearly coming from the clothes. Yet everyone's brain automatically conflates the disproportioned goose-down pads and the model's actual body. This conflating is something that our brains do automatically. We've been trained to let clothes tell us what bodies underneath them look like. Push-up bras, peignets, corsets, a little bit of shoulder padding, waist trainers, elevator shoes, weaves, wigs, and makeup. These are just a few ways that we augment our bodies, and nobody bats an eye about it. Comme des Garçons uses this automatic response in our brains to play a trick on us. When the model emerges and we look at her and we say, oh no, what happened? That's Ray breaking the subject-object binary by combining them. The clothes and the model's body became one thing. If you remember, a long time ago, we were talking about the show Resisting Interpretation, and so far it seems like a lot of interpretation has come out. You're welcome. But this show does resist interpretation in a really specific way, and we're now going to walk that out. Chapter 3, Resisting Interpretation. The title to this show has guided interpretation of this show since day one. Body meets dress, dress meets body. From day one, all the fashion critics were saying that this show was about society's poor treatment of disabled folks or about the hegemony of men over women. And while both of those things are true, and there has been a lot of great art that's been made about them, those wouldn't have been such popular interpretations if those fashion critics hadn't heard the title. Because Comme des Garçons makes abstract art, we hang on every clue that they'll give us for understanding that art. If they provide us with a title, we gobble the title up, and that becomes our guiding light for understanding the art. But this show is built to resist interpretation. The way it's able to do so is the process through which it was made. We're going to look now at that process guided to us by various quotes that Andrew Bolton pulled from Ray and different pattern cutters on our team. That's a process that I have later confirmed with a former pattern cutter at Comme des Garçons. The Comme des Garçons design studio is made up of two job titles, pattern cutter and Ray Kawakubo. Each season, Ray Kawakubo starts off with a single word to spark inspiration. Usually it's just literally a single word. She started with the word anger before. For another season, we know that she started with the word energy. She's even started collections with a simple abstract drawing. One time she literally crumpled up a piece of paper, handed it to her pattern cutters and said, make it like this. The pattern makers then all go out and separately work to try to uncover what that inspiration is meant to look like. They are not working as a team, sharing ideas with each other. My understanding is that each pattern cutter goes out and works separately. So once one pattern designer comes to Ray and shows them her idea, she then is able to say yes or no. And if it's yes, she then shows it to the other pattern cutters and says, make your work now more like this. And then the process starts all over again. After many revisions, one pattern cutter will bring an idea to Ray. Ray will say, this feels right. And then she'll show it to the other pattern cutters and say, make your idea more like this. And then the process keeps going, more and more edits until finally they have a whole collection. Okay, crucially, the most important part of this process, the title of the show and the inspiration that started it are not the same thing. Ray did not tell her designers, body meets dress, dress meets body. Strangely enough, the starting word for this show was Renaissance. We know this because the hairstylist for this show and many other shows, Julian Dyes, I think that's pronounced Dyes, I'm not sure. He has a sketch that was preparing for this show where there is the word Renaissance written on the paper in Julian's script. It should be noted here that that technically isn't Renaissance, it's like Renaissance. He misspelled it. I think it's pretty clear that the word intention here is Renaissance. This doesn't mean anything different in French, it's just the word Renaissance. Don't worry, Julian, I also cannot spell Renaissance. Julian is brought into the artistic process similar to how the pattern cutters are brought in, by being given a keyword, presumably the same keyword. And you can kind of see that played out in other Comme des Garçons shows, where the hair and the makeup and then the clothes, they don't look like they were considered together at all, yet they work well when they do come together. Even if we bounce around to different seasons that are even decades apart, it looks like two separate groups of people interpreting the same prompt totally differently. So yeah, I don't think we, the audience, were meant to know what the prompt was that they started with, but Ray gave it to Julian. Julian wrote it on a sketch. That sketch was published in Andrew Bolton's book, and now I know about it. So pretty cool. I feel obligated to tell you that it's possible that they could have been a separate keyword for Julian than with the pattern cutters, but I really think it was the same one. After all, different people interpreting the same word in their own way is what Ray is allowing all of her pattern cutters to do individually. Our big takeaway here is that Combs' process is very, very radical. Ray isn't setting a theme as much as she's giving a prompt that will be interpreted radically different by many different people. And for any smartasses that are like, oh, Renaissance, wouldn't you just make everything look like the 14th century? No, you wouldn't, you smartass. Ray hates historic clothes. She doesn't like using them. Andrew talks about that a good bit in his book. But the most radical thing about the process of creating a Comme show is that the central artist, Ray Kawakubo, is involved in the whole process, yet the process naturally removes her from creating anything. It's no coincidence that the company isn't called Ray Kawakubo. If there's any industry that wants you to name something after yourself, it's fashion. That like pretty much all of our brands are just the names of people. But this company isn't called Ray Kawakubo. It's called Comme des Garçons. She removed herself, both in name and in practice. Back to the process. Ray Kawakubo is the starting point for everything. It's her damn company. She bought the workroom. She hired all of those pattern cutters. She supplied them with a workroom. She even supplied them with a prompt. Yet all elements of design are out of her hands. Is it becoming clear how fucking radical this is? It's like Ray Kawakubo is using human Midjourney, where you're only able to give a one-word prompt to start, and then your only input is yes or no, 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 no. How would you even get one dress made like this, let alone a 57-look collection? This would be impossible. And this process does seem contrived and just mega inefficient compared with all other ways you could design something. But you have to consider that Ray's goals are different. She is only focused on making something new. Newness is hard to find. There's no traditional way of working that will help you find that newness. So Ray removed herself from the process in search of that newness. Okay, so if all of that is true, then it seems that we have reached a pretty pivotal place in our interpretive journey here. If we consider that artistic process for the creation of this Comme show, then a lot of interpretations of this show just aren't possible. The art, by, again, the nature of that process, it just resists those interpretations. Now, there's one fairly popular interpretation of this show that puts it side by side with the 1969 Japanese film Horrors of Malformed Men. Now, as a side by side, that is a compelling interpretation of this show. And to the author of that interpretation, Bethany Rose Lamont, you're an interpretive titan. Great work, absolutely stunning. I can't believe you found that. But unfortunately, that interpretation isn't possible if we consider Combs' process. There isn't a part of the process where Ray shows her team a movie. In fact, the process is set up so that even if Ray did have that vision in her head of the horrors of malformed men, there would be no way for her to realistically bring that into reality. Even then, it doesn't work because the whole purpose of this kind of mood board style of interpretation is to assign intention to the artist. Even if the art doesn't mean this, it's at least based off of this. And I think everybody likes finding these little interpretive nuggets because it gives us some semblance of control. Like, if you feel like you found the source, then you feel like you better understand the art as a result. And to be honest, that's usually fine. Martin Margiela was inspired to make tabby boots when he saw what Japanese construction workers wore on their feet. Craig Green did see those weird t-shirt folding things and thought, oh man, that pattern looks crazy. Rick Owens did look at Peter Bruegel's Tower of Babel and then managed to turn it into a dress. This happens constantly in fashion, and there is nothing wrong with this type of interpretation, but it just doesn't work for this runway show because the way that this and every other CDG show comes about is through radically different means. If there is artistic intention here, it's either imagined or it's so watered down that it's barely relevant if it's relevant at all. And that's how this show, the art itself, is able to resist interpretation. It takes your mood board idea, it feeds it into the process machine, and just grinds it up until there's nothing left. Chapter 4, Destroying Binaries. Okay? Yeah. I feel great. I feel so good. Based on this process that Ray Kawakubo has laid out for us, the destruction of binaries is something that the CDG team discovered, not something that they set out to do. Okay, so the destruction of binaries at its core is about destroying generalizations. We need to walk that out a little bit. There's nothing wrong with categorizing things into simple boxes, but binaries kind of encourage us to divide everything into a two-size-fits-all system. An example would be something like apples. Are apples good or bad for you? Healthy or unhealthy? That's a really straightforward question if you only think about it for 2 seconds. Apples are very healthy. They're good for you. Unless you only wanted to eat just apples, because that might make you throw up and probably would destroy your stomach lining. Okay, but that's insane. No one is thinking about only eating apples. Apples are healthy for you. Unless you have like an apple allergy or something. But I mean, so few people have apple allergies. That's really not relevant to this discussion. Apples are healthy for you. Unless you are trying to maintain a low FODMAP diet because you happen to have IBS. And a lot of people do have IBS. Oh, it also doesn't work if you're diabetic. You probably can't have apples all the time if you're diabetic. Also, there are some skin rashes that are actually exacerbated. So a doctor might tell you that healthy, unhealthy is not a helpful or productive binary through which to talk about apples. Back to subject object. The subject, us and our bodies, that was changing dramatically around the time that this show came out. Based on that, it makes so much sense that Ray would start with this idea of, oh, I'm going to destroy the binary between body and not body. But I don't think she did. I mean, the whole point of extreme processes is to just keep trying something that's so wild that maybe at the end of it, you will discover something new. That's kind of the weird thing about binaries, is that we all just sort of made them up for simplicity's sake. They very rarely accurately reflect the reality around us. I think Ray saw that. Andrew Bolton observes that Ray Kawakubo compares her own process to that of a Zen cone. Andrew goes on to compare many of the titles of Comme shows to Zen cones as well, like Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body. Andrew defines a Zen cone as, quote, a riddle Zen masters employ to evaluate a student's progress towards attaining enlightenment, end quote. And actually, there's an unbelievable quote. I know 2 quotes in a row, sorry. But there's an unbelievable quote from Victor Sojin Hori in his text that's called Kone and Kensho in the Rinzai Zen Curriculum, where he says, quote, Kone after Kone explores the theme of non-duality. This scholar is not talking about this Comme show. This is just true of Zen cones, which Ray compared her own process to. Back to the quote. He then quotes a well-known Zen cone saying, "Two hands clap and there is a sound. What is the sound of one hand? Is clearly about two and one. The cone asks, you know what duality is. Now what is non-duality?" There is a tension when you break down a binary. When you examine and you interrogate that tension that results from combining a binary or destroying it completely, that has enriched every scientific, academic, and artistic discipline known to man. And here, Ray's employing the same strategy. You break down the binary so we can explore a hypothetical future of human bodies. Chapter 5, The Artists. My goal here is not to pass off this video as some kind of definitive interpretation for this show. As we've seen, I don't even think that a definitive interpretation is possible. So my ultimate goal here is to provide a few different perspectives for you to look at this show through. And one of those perspectives is to look at this show through the lens of the art that Rei Kawakubo chose to place her art next to. Rei Kawakubo, for this show in particular, chose to put her Spring '97 show in conversation with some artists that you and I are extremely familiar with, like Martin Margiela, and other artists that are a little bit more of a deep cut, like Merce Cunningham. Placing one thing next to another thing so it can be informed by the second thing is an incredibly old technique. It's essentially just context. An ice pick at a party is just a useful little tool. A bloody ice pick on an evidence table is a little bit of a different story. We will largely be using a magazine called Visionaire for this. Visionaire is an experimental publication that focuses on fashion. For their 20th issue, Visionaire let Rei Kawakubo guest edit the whole issue. So ultimately, this magazine is a piece of art by Rei Kawakubo. And the most captivating part of this magazine is the binaries that are created here. We have left page, right page, which is Ray's work, and then the work of somebody else. Now, I realize that this is not a binary the same way that like hot and cold is a binary, but the model that Ray sets up here is a great tool for learning to break out of that dual system that we've now learned is completely useless. I look at the left page, I look at the right page, and my brain starts automatically finding ways to conflate them, to bring them together. Let's look closer, first through the example of Kishin Shinuyama. Mr. Shinuyama helps us understand how the body and the dress come together as one. Kishin is a Japanese photographer whose life has been full of all kinds of crazy projects. He took this incredible portrait of Japanese novelist Yukio Mishima. He also documented the most awkward kiss of all time. He was also found guilty by the Japanese government for, quote, public indecency and defiling a place of worship. Kishin himself wasn't indecent. He was shooting models in the nude. Shinuyama's work is unusual for him in this magazine. Close-up photographs of fish, crustaceans. We have a few photos where I can't even clock what the subject is. Those photos are paired in the magazine adjacent to close-up photos of the collection on mannequins. We need to look at Shinuyama's wider work, though, for the context that we need here, even though these photographs are awesome. I especially like this one. This is a really cool picture. Shinuyama shot a lot of nudes of both women and men. Some of these I take to just be tasteful softcore porn, but we see some really interesting tricks in other photographs. Like this one. This is part of a full series, but I can't show you the rest of it because I would get demonetized. There's a lot of nudity in these. If we look at these two women, they're framed by the rock that they're laying on. It looks like their torsos are just inhumanly long. If you didn't notice that when I first showed it to you, don't beat yourself up. Our brains naturally will correct this warped perception just automatically without us even thinking about it. Like in this photo, no one is looking at this thinking like, oh my gosh, why is that metal rod jutting out of Bliss's head? You just sort of know that it was a sloppily taken photograph. There is no metal rod in my head. And I think that's what we're meant to infer here, something about this automatic correction that our brain does. Our brain sees something like this and immediately start writing its own story about physical deformation that our conscious brains know ultimately is not true. Separately, there could be something here about the cubist idea of seeing the human body from multiple perspectives all at the same time. Maybe these dresses are meant to depict the same human form in different physical positions simultaneously. If we already know that the body and the dress are now one, we shouldn't eliminate the possibility that Rei Kawakubo has created the first fashion collection composed entirely of cubist portraits. Like, did you catch that? Like, this look here could be like the model simultaneously standing up straight and doing this with her arms. This look, or at least this one part of the look, could be like the most unflattering position that you can like work your stomach into to like make it bulge in a weird way. The way Ray chose to lay all this out are a new kind of binary, one where we're automatically accepting that the two things are meant to be taken together as a single thing. Moving on to familiar territory, it is time to talk about Martin Margiela, folks. Let's go. If we crack open the pages of Visionaire magazine, number 20 again, we find a section where Ray is being interviewed in a pretty unusual way. The magazine asks her a pretty simple question. Ray usually answers with images. For example, at one point they ask Ray, "How old are you?" And she responds with an image of a model wearing Ray's clothes, and the model is holding her own daughter. In another section, they ask her, "What do you wear to bed at night?" And she answers with a picture of the Comme des Garçons perfume, which sort of implies that it's like, aha, I sleep naked. Okay, so later on in the interview, they ask her, "Does this go?" And Ray responds with two separate images. Like I said, two images, but the one that I want to emphasize is one where the model is wearing an all-red lump look, along with this tiny little just sliver of barely a piece of clothing at all that is by Martin Margiela that has a really specific story to it. Quickest of quick rundowns for those who are not aware, Martin Margiela is a retired fashion designer who spent his career both questioning the fashion system and setting trends inside of it. Similar to Ray Kawakubo, Martin Margiela was exploring the body's relationship to clothes in his Spring '97 collection through what's called the Stockman Show. The mainstay piece was this jacket. It was modeled after the core of every fashion collection, which is the dress form. Margiela's point was that clothes are objects that are meant to serve the women who choose them. Yet women are caught in this system wherein they go to a store, they buy an object, a dress, that was never even modeled on a human. The object was modeled on a different object, which is the mannequin. Martin's point that if the body, rather than this lifeless object, was the starting point, then we would all be in a much better place. Once he had established his new mannequin, the human body, Martin began the process anew, the process of making clothes. And in the final collection, the idea was that the new work had only just begun. We can see here that the new work just beginning is what Ray chose to put onto her new idea for a body. When placing her work in the same editorial with Martin Margiela, Ray is answering the question, does this go, with more questions? A few that come to mind are we heading in the same direction? Are Martin and I even talking about the same thing? Martin and Ray saw a very similar problem, but came up with wildly different solutions for it. I have been waiting so long to talk about this. Let's talk about Merce Cunningham. In the same way that Ray places her work next to other artists in the Visionaire magazine, the same comparative analysis can be done for other mediums of art as well. In this case, dance. When the body is the subject, and also the subject of the art, lol, it points to an obvious relationship with dance. Merce Cunningham is, I'm told, the most important choreographer of the 20th century. If you don't know anything about this man, you gotta go watch his work in more detail later. Merce is a creative titan whose work should be studied regardless of what your vocation is. I don't care if you're in fashion, if you're just generally a creative person. Honestly, I don't care if you're an engineer. Merce Cunningham's work is for everybody. Here's the short version of what we'll be discussing concerning Merce and Ray. Cunningham and Kawakubo collaborated on an art piece that involved choreography and this fashion collection. The name of that art piece is Scenario. We can't count Scenario as part of the runway show in particular, but history has all but tied them up together. Photos from this piece are often mistakenly labeled as just part of the original runway show. Scenario premiered a year after the original runway show at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. In the credits, Ray Kawakubo is listed as being responsible for the set, the lighting, and of course, the costumes. Scenario is a crucial part of understanding body meets dress, dress meets body, because it is such an excellent example of Ray using the work of others to highlight what she wants us to understand about her own work. There aren't a lot of pieces like this in Ray's catalog. The only other one that I could We have other little examples like the work that she did with Cindy Sherman, but I honestly couldn't find anything else in her oeuvre that's on the same scale as Scenario. Merce Cunningham loved collaborating with other artists, some of the biggest names being his life partner and also regular collaborator, the composer John Cage. He also worked with Brian Eno, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns. The man loved working with other people. I have a strong feeling that this is why the two wanted to work together in the first place. When speaking about Scenario, Ray said, quote, "We both believe in accident, experiment, and risk," end quote. There are some delicious comparisons between their processes. When choreographing for his dancers, Merce would regularly choreograph legs separate from choreographing torso, separate from choreographing the arms. He would fill pages and pages of notes for just simple movements. Moreover, his dances often were randomized. Humans are obviously horrible at coming up with real randomness, so Merce trailblazed and began using a piece of software that's called Lifeforms to help generate random movements for his dancers. He'd bring his notes to his troupe and start giving instruction. Further, he would use what he called chance operations, where a movement would be determined by the flip of a coin or some other chance system that he had put into place. Sometimes, get this, sometimes the order of the steps in a sequence would not be known until the performance, where it would then be determined by a chance operations. Dancers would need to learn the moves so completely that they could comply with the result of the chance operations. And look, you don't have to have had any experience dancing to understand how fucking brutal this was. Look closely at the way their bodies are moving individually. I know this seems like the dancers are just doing whatever, but this is all precisely mapped. If someone didn't execute their specific right leg movement correctly, Merce would know, he would stop the rehearsal and he would call them out on it. This was the most purposefully discordant use of body movements in popular dance history. Are you starting to see some similarities between Merce and Ray, like maybe understanding a bit about why they got along so well? Both artists needed to make fully unique work. They only wanted their name on something that was new. So instead of being the image of the lone tortured artist, both Cunningham and Kawakubo created environments where a team of pattern cutters must struggle to create, and a piece of software spits out movements that dancers must then obey, even when it's almost physically impossible. Merce and Ray guided their respective arts directly and indirectly. Merce actually had some fascinating precedent for costuming that would inhibit the dancer's movements rather than help it in his piece called Antic Meat from 1958. There's a chair strapped to his back in this one. Similarly, the pieces from Body Meets Dress provoke our brains to make all kinds of symbolic tie-ins on a runway, but when met on a stage, they seem to be designed specifically to inhibit the dance movements from happening. One of the original troupe members confessed in an interview that he got so frustrated with the skirt that was built into his costume that he hiked it up at one point and just said fuck it and just did his leg movements normally. We unfortunately do not have footage of that. One final miscellaneous note is that the original runway and this performance share a lot of similarities in their staging. It's largely just a blank white cube. Ray loves blank spaces. She even originally planned for Scenario to take place in a fully enclosed white box with, that's actually it. She just said we were going to do it in a completely enclosed white box. And then Merce, I'm sure, respectfully said, we can't do an enclosed white box because the dancers need to enter the staging area. To which I'm sure Ray said, ugh, fine. And then they just did it Merce's way. Scenario and the inclusion of Merce Cunningham gives us something that could be mistaken for a conclusion here. Their processes aren't the same, but Merce has just this incredible quote about his process that illuminates Body Meets Dress. He said, quote, "The use of chance operations opened out my way of working. The body tends to be habitual. The use of chance allows us to find new ways to move and to put movements together that would not otherwise have been available to us. It revealed possibilities that were always there, except that my mind hadn't seen them," end quote. Ray Kawakubo did not seek to reveal some grand truth about human bodies and our binary relationship with clothes when she started designing this collection. Like Merce, Ray trusted the process that had been set up. That process was meant to help her discover something new. The process wasn't meant to do anything else. The Comme process doesn't guarantee some incredible new collection every time, but it can and often does produce one. When you depend on flipping coins and randomized software to make your choreography, you can't also embed symbolism into the dance. When you split a group of pattern makers into a closed loop system, you can't ensure that the viewers of the final show will learn a lesson about their bodies. But during her quest to find new clothes, Ray did find a lesson about humans in our bodies. She didn't put that lesson into her art. She trusted the process, and then when the process reached a conclusion, she was as surprised by that thunderous realization as we all are today. We have to remember that while we're interpreting this show, Ray was its first interpreter. She gave the collection a name and then sent it out into the world where that interpretation would belong to everyone. There's a great story that rose from an interview between Ray Kawakubo and Susannah Frankel for The Guardian directly after this show took place. Ms. Frankel asked Ray to please explain her new collection, and Ray, in one of the hardest moments of fashion history, grabbed a piece of paper, a black pen, she drew a circle on the paper, rose from her seat, and left the room silently. I want to read you a section of Andrew Bolton's interview with Ray Kawakubo from his Met Gala book. In this section, they're talking about Andrew's curation for the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition on Comme. Andrew begins, quote, "To a great extent, though, the role of a curator is defined by interpretation." Ray responds, "It's your job, I know, and I understand it. Fundamentally, you set yourself an impossible task from the beginning. I've never liked my clothes being interpreted, so I was never going to be comfortable with your interpretation, irrespective of its perspective. Nothing you could have come up with would have made me happy. Basically, I've never wanted my work to be understandable." Hey, if you're watching this right now, then you are in the top 5 percentile of attention spans that watch this channel. Congratulations. I worked on this episode off and on for about 3 years. Usually the off time was me being freaked out about completing the episode because I didn't want to put it out because then it would be done and then I might have messed it up. Only time will tell if that has actually happened or not. I feel really proud of the work that Danielle and I have done on this one. But the on time was spent buying a lot of expensive books, doing an enormous amount of reading, doing a lot of writing, doing a lot of rewriting, and spending, honestly, a lot of time just sitting and thinking about the work. The only way that Danielle and I are able to make episodes like this one, or the recent Prada episode, which required a ton of research, or the Margiela series, or future series that we can't tell you about yet, is because of the Patreon. We're able to make this our full-time focus. Our income does not depend on us chasing down the most views possible for every single video. I'm guessing that if you look at the results from this one, this is not breaking any records on the views. But it doesn't have to, because the people who are on our Patreon want us to be able to pursue the things that maybe everyone on Earth doesn't want to see, but are important for us to talk about. All that to say, if you get value out of the content that you see on this channel, we only ask that you put that value back into the channel. We have a student tier if you're super broke, but honestly, if you get $9 of value out of this channel, please put $9 back into it. If you get $15, join the $9 tier and bump it up. All that we ask is that whatever you're getting from this content, you put back into it. The goal someday is for us to be able to put out work that pretty much only looks like this, where we're able to just spend as much time and go as deep as the work will allow us to go. And a huge thank you to everybody who already supports us. You really are making this channel run from the bottom of our heart. Thank you. I also want to give a huge shout out to all of the folks who have done an enormous amount of work on this show in the past. We have a complete list of works cited in the description, and the works cited thing is pretty important, and I really would like for you to go look at it. What we do here, I do not want for Daniela and I to be some of the only people that tackle this level of work. I want you to go look at the work cited in the description of this video so that you can start reading fashion theory academic work. I want you to engage with that also. You can engage with it. It's really difficult stuff to read. You can't read it like you read a novel. You have to really sit down. You have to take notes. You have to really focus while you're at it. But that stuff is so worth digging into because it helps you to appreciate what you already love in fashion on a much deeper level. Also, most of the folks that wrote books and essays that contributed to this video are my actual real life heroes. So shout out to all of you. I won't name everybody by name, but yeah, you all know who you are, and I think you know you are my heroes. Finally, something I think everybody should know, this is gonna seem like a meme, but I promise I'm being sincere. Rei Kawakubo does not want interpretation of her work to be performed at all, and certainly not interpretation that's being pushed out into the world in a public way. She kind of just wants you to sit with the work and wrestle with it on your own terms, and I have gone completely against her wishes with that. I felt that this work and what we can learn from it is so incredibly important that it would be wrong for me not to do this if I'm able to do it. So I truly mean it, full sincerity. I'm sorry, Ray. I hope you understand. Thank you so much for joining me. Everybody have a good one. I'll see you soon.